35 states that have voluntarily come together to create fewer, higher, deeper standards. They're world-class.
The 5 people who didn't agree to sign the letter simply were expunged from the record.
The real issue in American education is that people without a whole lot of experience are dictating education policy.
I'm trying to think of something analogous to this that slipped through so easily on a national basis. I really can't.
Is the most meaningful reform of our public schools in a generation.
Common Core.
Throw away their local standards.
And so I think just being straightforward, continuing to tell the truth is very important.
We had to sign a confidentiality agreement that we would not ever discuss what took place in the meeting itself.
Protest against Common Core.
It was controversial.
Race to the middle.
The biggest misconception that Common Core proponents push on people is that there is any evidence that a system like Common Core will benefit children.
To do education reform right, you need standards, but you also need greater parental choice. And I think the best argument for this Common Core are the standards themselves.
It takes power from the parent. It de-incentivizes the parent from a deep and abiding interest in their child's education.
A Maryland parent
was arrested last week after speaking out about Common Core.
Don't stand for this. You're sitting here like cattle. You have questions. You put them. They don't want it.
They're not accountable to the public.
What is the best case scenario that you foresee?
I don't see any.
Show us the most innovative plans to improve teacher quality and student achievement, we'll show you the money. We launched a competition called Race to the Top. And these standards were developed, by the way, not by Washington, but by Republican and Democratic governors throughout the country.
The Common Core is a project of 2 organizations in Washington, D.C.
People need to know about the Common Core because standards undergird everything in the education system.
The federal government was pushing states to align.
They're trying to quantify everything, and this will make it all right. No, we'll be a nation where nobody's brilliant.
The people who support Common Core believe in elites and bureaucrats telling thousands of other people what to do.
You remember The Wizard of Oz, where he was a little man standing behind the big controls, but in this case, there isn't even a little man.
Wow, we got a full room. Hi, I'm Susie Kahn, and this is Heather Chappelle, and we are from Faithful Christian Servants. First of all, we want to thank Calvary Chapel Tustin for opening up their home to us tonight. And we want to thank all of you for taking the time and the interest to come out tonight. This truly started with a couple of moms having coffee and praying. So I'm going to open us with a prayer this evening. Dear Heavenly Father, you have blessed us immeasurably living in this greatest nation. We pray blessings over our meeting tonight, our speakers, Sandra, Lydia, and Brad, as they share the information they have on Common Core. We pray everyone here will be blessed with the knowledge of our speakers and will leave here tonight motivated as Americans to learn more and stand strong for the children. Amen. Faithful Christian Servants welcomes you to our second informational meeting, the Unveiling of the Common Core. We are concerned for our children in this city, state, and nation. And as Abraham Lincoln warned, the philosophy of the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next. As we are just concerned parents who have donated their time, talents, and dug deep into their pockets to get this information out, we greatly appreciate any donations, as we have been blessed so far with speakers donating their time to provide this information. We do need to provide transportation, food, lodging, the printing costs, even some venue costs and things that are unseen. So we do have a donation table out front with fun things like Adopt a Sign, t-shirts, buttons, and bumper stickers. So please, this evening when you're done, you can go out and visit the table and see Linda out there with the goods.
Thank you, Susie. For those of you who don't know what Common Core is, it's a set of national standards that in 2009 was bribed upon each state And at that point in time, they were in desperate need of money. We as faithful Christian servants are against this, not only spiritually, but academically and constitutionally as well. After the presentations this evening, we hope that you too will understand some, if not all, of our reasons why. With us tonight, we have three amazing speakers who are extremely educated, not only in their own field of expertise, but also on the topic of Common Core. Our first speaker, Dr. Sandra Stotsky, is here tonight with us tonight from Boston. She is a professor of education emerita at the University of Arkansas, where she held the 21st Century Chair in Teacher Quality. She served as a senior associate commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education from 1999 to 2003, where she was in charge of developing and revising all the K-12 standards. She served on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education from 2006 to 2010, and on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel from 2006 to 2008. She is now more recently known for serving on the Common Core Validation Committee from 2009 to 2010. She was one of the 5 members of the Validation Committee who would not sign off on the standards as being validated. Our second speaker, Lydia Gutierrez, has been in the classroom teaching elementary school students for 22 years. She has her master's in education, math, and multicultural education, and she is currently a candidate for California State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Our final speaker, Brad Dacus, is the founder and president of the Pacific Justice Institute, which defends parental rights, religious and civil liberties across the California and the nation. He served as legislative assistant to U.S. Senator Phil Gramm and went on to receive his Juris Doctor from the University of Texas School of Law. Brad Dacus can be heard weekly on the Dacus Report on radio stations across the country. I have a couple reminders. There is no eating or drinking other than bottled water in the sanctuary. Also, we would greatly appreciate it if you would silence your cell phones. Before we get started, I'd like to see a show of hands. How many parents are in the audience, parents of elementary school students? A lot. How about middle school students? A lot. Any elected officials? Great. Over here? Great. Teachers? Yes. And last but not least, grandparents. All right. Great. Well, we want to welcome each and every one of you. And now, without further ado, we'd like to introduce to you Dr. Sandra Stotsky.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all very much for your warm welcome and for the wonderful tour of California I am making, starting from very south of here to, I know I'm going to a lot farther north in a few days, and it's just been an exhausting but very exciting set of days for me. Let me begin with just a couple of words of advice, one of which connects to what Brad Dacus is going to talk about. After listening to a number of parents who have been expressing their concern about the kinds of form letters or responses they get when they say they want to opt out their kids, you don't have to ask for permission to opt out your child. You have a right to do that as a parent at any time. And I think it is unfortunate if officials from the Department of Ed or the commissioner or local school boards don't understand and don't recognize or give you some double talk. But all parents do have the right to take their kids out of school or keep them out for any particular activity and just send in an excuse note. That's all that's necessary. They do not have to ask for permission. Now, the other idea is one that will need to be explored a little bit more, and I came up with it after talking a few days ago with a few parents. If there are high-achieving high schools or school systems in the state where most of the students go on to college, you have achieved the goal of college readiness standards. Therefore, and this is the logic I want you to think about, why do you need to adopt college readiness standards when most of your students have already achieved the goal of going on to college, and you have some empirical evidence that that's what they can do? So try exempting yourself from adopting college readiness standards when you can show that whatever you've been doing has already produced college-ready students. Try it. We need to call the bluff of these bureaucratic bullies, as I see it, at the state and federal level. Let me now start off with a very brief big picture as I see it, because I come to what I have to say not only from what I did in the Massachusetts Department of Education, but from the years' experience on the most bizarre committee I've ever been on, Common Core's Validation Committee, a very peculiar committee about which you can find almost nothing because it was private and there are no records available, and I had to sign a confidentiality agreement in order to stay on it. It was that kind of non-transparency. There were 4 basic groups that were bypassed in the effort to develop and get Common Core standards approved by all of the states in this country, and it's done its job on 46 of them. First, parents had no idea what was happening. Only last year have they begun to be aware of what's happened to their public schools. Second were teachers. They were also not told or informed or given input in general into what were to be the national standards. Third were state legislators. I've been speaking to about 25 state legislatures as a witness, and the first question is, what is Common Core? What are we getting these bills for technology for? Nobody bothered to tell them, particularly their own state boards of education. And then fourth, local school boards were bypassed. These are, of course, the 4 major groups who should be concerned with the education of children. They're the closest, and they were deliberately bypassed. It was a top-down bureaucratic process model, and only now are the waves of protest beginning. They started last year. Why? Because both parents and teachers began to see what lessons were actually in the curriculum that were called Common Core lessons or based on Common Core. And then the explanations kept coming forth. Oh, this is an implementation problem. It's not a problem with the standards. It's these teachers and administrators who don't know what they're doing. These poor materials are being developed and stamped Common Core aligned, and nobody really understands these poor standards. They're so good, but nobody appreciates how good they are. Let's begin with some facts, and this is available as information. Will be posted on a number of websites, but I last month decided to come up with my set of facts that I know from my experience and from my own research, because I've been an academic researcher all my life. After seeing a number of so-called fact sheets by Common Core supporters, they usually start out with, here are the myths and here are the facts. Well, I realized that you needed to reverse the 2 columns. Here are the so-called myths, which are really the facts, and then here are the answers that are really myths, not real facts. And so I've even done a spoof that I've put on the Pioneer Institute website. These are not state-led standards. We know that 3 private organizations in Washington, D.C., the National Governors Association, the Council for Chief State School Officers, and Achieve, Inc., which is a spin-off of the NGA, all were funded for the purpose of developing these standards by a 4th private organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Because this is all a private project, there are no records available. No one can FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. No one can get anything from any of them. Why they chose the people they did for the different committees, who selected whom, what they were paid, none of that information is available. The decisions they made, the feedback that was given by various organizations, who made the decisions about that feedback, None of that's available. And why that matters as process and transparency, for me, and this is something I always like to tell audiences, I come from a very strong involvement in my own home community in the affairs of self-government, which is the really big loser out of Common Core here. I was a town meeting member for 10 years in my hometown. That's an elected office. I was a library trustee for 14 years, also an elected office. And I know what sunshine laws are, what minutes of meetings are for, why you have open meetings, and so on. None of that could happen, and it relates to the foundations for the approval we were expected on the validation committee to give. But before we get there, let me just briefly go through who are these various groups of people who wasn't there on these different committees. Who were the people on the standards development work groups? Why the media was deliberately not paying attention, we don't know, but they just never wanted to ask the right questions. Most of them were connected to testing development. They were connected to test and curriculum developers on the standards development work groups. We don't know who necessarily chose them, but we think, because there's no official information available, that Achieve Inc. and the Gates Foundation selected them. Our national standards were developed in secrecy all the way through. Very strange for what were to become national standards. Who was not on this group in 2009, which was before I became active on the validation committee, who was not on this group, which should have aroused suspicion, not paranoia, but genuine suspicion and skepticism. High school English teachers weren't there, high school math teachers weren't there, English professors, scientists, engineers, parents, legislators, early childhood educators, and local and state school board members. The very kinds of people you would have thought would be involved in developing something called college readiness standards. And you have to think about that title, because we've never had in this country or in any other country anything called college readiness standards. They're plain old standards. They're high school standards for determining high school diploma, graduation requirements. We've never had anything that bypassed high school diploma requirements so that you could do an end run from a college readiness test if you passed it in grade 11 and get right to college if you were accepted and wanted to go, and could get credit for your freshman courses that related to the level of that college readiness test that you took. And that was one of the major goals in practice of this whole set of standards. How to get kids from a college readiness test that is probably between an 8th and 9th grade level in difficulty, but there are more issues than that, to credit-bearing college level courses, particularly in math. What that means is that you may have kids taking intermediate algebra at the college level for credit. That may be college readiness in this country. We will become an international laughingstock. Who are the people who were qualified, supposedly, to write these standards? Well, they weren't really qualified. Let me speak first of the ELA standards writers. Their names are known, David Coleman and Susan Pimentel. They had never taught reading, never taught English, neither had majored in English as undergraduates, neither has a doctorate in English, neither had ever published any serious works on K-12 in curriculum and instruction. And at the time they were appointed, no one knew them. No one knew who on earth they were in the entire field. No other country would have had such unknown people developing its national standards, especially when they didn't have any academic credentials to do anything in the English language arts. In math, it was a slightly different situation, but it raises a different question. Two of the math standards writers did have PhDs in mathematics, Jason Zimba and Bill McCallum. The third member of the team, whose name is Phil Darrow, had majored in English. Go figure. None had ever developed K-12 math standards before. Would any other country have ever had such a peculiar group of people developing its national standards? It's hard to think that they would have allowed such a non-credible situation to take place. We don't know why they were chosen, who chose them, what the contracts were like, because, as I say, none of that information is available. What was the ostensible purpose of the committee I was finally put on? And I'll explain briefly why I got onto that committee, because one of the questions that's always asked me is, given my 4 years of steady criticism, how did I ever get onto this committee? Why did they want me? And I'm sure they've regretted it ever since. But I was put on this committee because I kept nagging the Commissioner of Education, Mitchell Chester in Massachusetts, who I had helped to actually choose to be the Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts when I was on the state board. He owed me a favor. And I wanted to be on the final, what I thought was going to be the final committee that would look at these standards, because what was the charge officially to this committee? It was to ensure that Common Core's standards were internationally benchmarked, which means comparable to the best in other countries, research-based, and rigorous. And I was one, as you heard, of 5 members. The other one, James Milgram, who is a professor of mathematics at Stanford, and who was put on this committee by then Governor Schwarzenegger. He was not given a choice. He was just said, you're going to be on this committee, because he had helped to write your wonderful math standards, K-12, that have served California well. But we were 2 of the 5 that didn't sign off, because we couldn't get any information about internationally benchmarking countries or the research base supporting whatever was done. I looked at ELA, he looked at math. We used to talk to each other. We knew something peculiar was going on, we just didn't know what. But we could not get any information on what countries were we benchmarked to in either subject. To this day, we do not know what countries we were benchmarked to. This is, by the way, a very serious Achilles heel for the standards, because the US ED promised the states in the race to the top applications that they would be able to adopt internationally benchmarked standards. And to this day, they haven't been able to show that. We know that they're not internationally benchmarked because they're much too low. So who else was on the validation committee? There weren't any high school math teachers, which one would have logically expected. Milgram was the only mathematician. I was the only English language arts standards person. There were a lot of people connected to schools of education. Many of them had doctorates in mathematics education, which doesn't mean that they can understand a set of high school math standards. Have to remember that. So 2 of us, who were the 2 content experts, were 2 of the 5 who didn't sign off. What was the real purpose of this committee? Very briefly, so far as we could figure out, we were to be rubber stamps. By the end of the year, we were to simply sign off. The other members of the committee did, and there are a variety of reasons why they did. One would have to look at their names, their affiliations, the grants they get, to begin to try to understand why so many just signed off when we didn't even have the evidence or the information that would have supported signing off. So the 3 chief deficiencies of these standards that have been imposed in 46 plus states are, and I want to repeat again because you really need to go around and repeat this kind of information. They're not rigorous, even though you will keep hearing parrots flying around saying rigorous, rigorous, rigorous. They're not. They're not research-based. There is a very unusual approach to the teaching of Euclidean geometry that Milgram has regularly talked about. There's no research base basically to support it. Maybe one country in Europe, Flemish Belgium, may be attempting to implement this particular approach. But it was tried in the old Soviet Union and quickly rejected because it was not successful. And most high school math teachers in this country don't have a clue about how to teach it. And we don't know what's going to happen with that subject in high school in this country because they're not capable of teaching a way to get to Euclidean geometry that was put into that document. And then, as I said before, the standards are not internationally benchmarked, so we're going to be outdone by our children's peers in any number of other countries. As Milgram has estimated in math, and has said this publicly in many, many places, by grade 8, our kids are going to be about 2 years behind their peers in other high-achieving countries. This is very serious, but it isn't quite as serious as what's going to happen by the end of high school in both subjects, not just math alone. As Professor Milgram has pointed out in a recent document that we co-authored, what is missing at the high school level are those standards that lead to STEM careers in college: science, technology, engineering, and math. They're just not in the document. And we know they're not in the document because the chief writer of the math standards, Jason Zimba, admitted they were not in the document. So how did the U.S. Chamber of Commerce get to endorse them? ExxonMobil get to endorse them? Even the Gates Foundation? We don't know. They don't know how to look at a set of high school math standards, but engineers, mathematicians, and scientists do, except that at higher ed, they apparently have not bothered to pay attention, and they were never invited by their boards of education at the time they adopted these standards to take a look and see what was in those college readiness standards. As Professor Milgram has said, those college readiness standards go up as far as weak algebra 2, which is not going to get anyone to a STEM career in a 4-year major in college. As far as ELA is concerned, there are several major deficiencies, and I'm not going to spend too much time on them because I really want to talk a little bit more about the political implications of what can be done today. And I've written so much in the past 4 years, all you need to do is go to my website to see all the details for the problems in the English language arts standards. They're skills, not content standards. They're skills standards, if you call them standards, which means that they can be attached at any grade level. There's no indication of grade level difficulty in the standard itself. And they stress writing over reading. Now, those of you with children in the elementary school are probably already aware of the problems with excessive writing. Math has been turned into a language arts class. Kids have been expected to write and write and write. Now, to some extent, it is reasonable to say kids need to explain whatever they are learning about the concepts in mathematics. But how much time should they be spending writing in a math class? How much time should they be spent writing in an English language arts class? Because the real balance should be more reading than writing. We know that from 100 years of research that good writers have been good readers. And every teacher knows that. Our students need more opportunities to read, not more writing than reading. You need to see the English language written out, good sentence structure, before you can absorb it and begin to write in complete sentences. So we've got the wrong balance all the way through. At the high school level, the serious problem, from my perspective, and it's received a lot of publicity, is the reduction of literary study in grades 6 to 12 and the increase in something called informational text. Now, there are some people who are thinking, not a bad idea. The problem there is that where do kids learn to read analytically and think and write analytically? If it comes anywhere in the curriculum, it comes from Good English teachers helping kids to learn how to read between the lines of complex literary texts, where you have ambiguities, ellipses, you have things that are left out deliberately. That's where kids learn to read all around and in between the lines and learn how to read analytically. That's not what the expectation is in math, science, or history textbooks. They're informational. You're supposed to read the information and understand it. You need a body of information in your head. You can't think critically with an intellectual vacuum in your head, but learning how to read critically, particularly analytically, you need the help of a teacher with literary texts. Well, it's been reduced to 50% because for reasons that we still don't quite understand why, David Coleman decided, maybe in the middle of the night at some point, that students, when they go to college, read mainly informational texts, so that's what their English teachers in high school should be doing. English teachers aren't happy about it, but they're not speaking up. That's another huge issue. Teachers as a group do not speak up unless they are singing Hosanna to Common Core. They do not, rarely do they ever utter any critical comments, because that would reflect poorly on the teacher evaluation that they might get, because that is what the purpose of the Race to the Top grant was, or those applications. So you have got a number of major problems in both documents. The other, last one I will mention in math, is deferring completion of Algebra 1 to grade 9 or even 10. What does that mean for those of you who follow how the science curriculum piggybacks on the math curriculum? It means you never get to advanced science or even advanced mathematics topics if you're still completing Algebra 1 in grade 9 or grade 10. So you've got a serious problem with what's happening at the high school level. It's been retarded. The bottom has been raised a bit in terms of expectations, and in fact, many early childhood educators will tell you it's inappropriate in grades K1, 2, but I think that was done deliberately to impress the New York Times editorial board. We're asking little kids to speak in complete sentences, write paragraphs. None of this really is developmentally appropriate. And when I looked at middle school writing, you can see in grade 6, children are expected to start writing with claims. And when I've talked to kids, the only claims they understand are baggage claims. They do not understand rhetorical claims, particularly since they've never read that kind of writing before. So you have very serious mismatch problems in this particular set of ELA standards. Many people then ask me, well, what did Massachusetts do? If you did such a good job with your standards, why did your Board of Education dump your great ELA standards and in math and in English language arts? I have about 5 minutes left. That's what that was for. I need a cue. In California, you had in math and science standards that were considered the gold standards for the country. You have lost the best standards in the country in math and science. I'll say another word about the science standards in a minute. They're not strictly Common Core, but they're related to Common Core. But in Massachusetts, Massachusetts was to be the sacrificial lamb. We knew that we were being courted to get rid of our standards so that other states would follow suit. And there were various reports that the Gates Foundation paid for, all showing basically there were no differences between Common Core standards and the Massachusetts standards. The real reason we knew was that we were promised $250 million of Race to the Top money, which we did get. And that was what we sold our good standards for. California didn't get Race to the Top money, but it did give up its great standards. Recently, I believe your Board of Education finally dumped its wonderful science standards. Why do I say they were wonderful? Because the standards that are being adopted that are called Next Generation Science Standards that Achieve Inc. has helped some science teacher organizations put together, they basically leave out high school chemistry. Why is that so ironic and worthy of note? Because your science standards were developed, some of you may recall, under the chairmanship of Glenn Seaborg, a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. I am sure your old standards treated chemistry with respect. And the current standards that your board has now put into place or is in the process of implementing basically leave chemistry out of high school. Why? We don't know. You know, nobody asks questions like that. So you have to think about what's going to be absent from our high school students' academic careers when they go to try to get into private colleges and universities in this country that can choose well-trained foreign students instead of poorly educated American students of all kinds. Remember, this isn't just going to hit certain groups, it's going to hit students in all demographic groups who could do high school level work in math and science. So then you start asking yourself, as I have over the years, how come the STEM standards were left out? Of the math standards, how come chemistry standards were left out of next generation science standards? Milgram and I have been asking that question for a few years. No answer. Remember, there were 2 PhDs in mathematics who wrote Common Core's math standards. They knew what they were leaving out. Why doesn't someone tell us why they left them out? We don't know. But these are the standards that have been adopted by over 46 boards of education, or in one case in Wisconsin, solo by the Commissioner of Ed because they don't have a state board of ed. And I was told in Wisconsin, where I testified twice, that when the final version of Common Core's standards came out on June 2nd, 2010, he got them in the morning and in the afternoon declared that Wisconsin had adopted Common Core standards. And this is what Wisconsin is now living with. So you've got these bizarre situations in which the legal authority there in these states' statutes enabled these boards of education to do what they did without doing 2 things that I think every state board should have done. And I've asked about this every time I testify. Did your state board of ed ask for a cost-benefit analysis from your legislature at the time it was ready to adopt? Not one. Number 2, when your state board was getting ready to adopt something called college readiness standards, did they bother to ask their own higher ed faculty? Every state has a major public university and engineering colleges, because I ask about them everywhere. Not one. So they have been negligent, irresponsible, and it's not because they're dumb. They're college-educated, intelligent people. We just don't understand how they could have behaved so irresponsibly. So we have a situation today in which we are facing a dumbing down of the K-12 curriculum. College first few years will be moved down to take up that vacuum that has been created, more or less. And the goal will be to get more students through college with diplomas. What will that mean? They will know not as much as students know today. They will know far less. How that will affect all the 21st century major professions and skills, we don't know. Remember, the jobs of the future involve math and science, for the most part. 21st century skills piggyback off of computer science, mathematics, science, economics, finance. These are all affected by what is happening. Teachers in the schools can understand this better. Certainly the high school math teachers do. they just don't speak up. I don't know why they can't be encouraged as a group to speak up more. But one thing I am telling everyone now, and I'm doing this far more systematically in the past couple of weeks, what has not been extinguished is local control of public schools. That is something that we have uniquely in this country from its founding. And they have the legal authority by virtue of having elected school board members who are responsible for decisions over standards, curriculum, and instruction at the local level. State boards may have authority over what tests have to be offered by these local units, but local school boards can reject Common Core standards, and in California, they certainly can say, let's go back to the ones we had before because it was clear they were far superior. Someone has asked, well, how will we know what the effect of Common Core will be in the future? And this is a very good question because we have no way of finding out in the future. All the indices have been dumbed down and aligned to Common Core. ACT, SAT, GED, the General Education Diploma, the National Norm Reference Tests, all of the regular indices that you could use to judge how far down your whole school system has gone will have been adjusted downward, so you have very few, if any, independent sources of information. And the only one I can recommend at this point that we know about is TIMSS, Third International Mathematics and Science Study, which has an international board and at this point may be immune to manipulation by Gates Foundation funding or USED pressure. We don't know. But at this point, they only do math and science, and maybe we'll find out there what's been happening to our school curriculum. But we do have to start paying attention at the local level. Parents have to be looking, as they have started to in the past year, at the kinds of lessons in both math and English their children are being given, and nag their school officials. I was one of those tiger moms, so I understand it. You remember, the squeaky wheel gets response, and your officials at your local school level are as in the dark as anybody else. They're just repeating talking points given to them. So you have to keep going after them and getting your local school board to set the policies it should. By statute, it still has most of those powers. I'm going to stop here because later on there will be questions, but you do need to hear what Lydia has to say and what Brad Dacus has to say. So thank you very much for your attention.